somebody posted a dialogue with, I think it was Siri the other day, when they'd said, "Hey, Siri, how is it going to be this fucking cold?" And Siri responded with, "There's no need for that." It's like, no, person who designed that interaction, there's no need for that. Siri can't be offended. Siri cannot have the emotional response that we have as a species. There is no biology in there to experience a taboo, to experience that raised adrenaline level. Welcome to the Royal Institution. It's so nice to be able to say that. The main reason that I'm into science is the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, and I can't help thinking of, sort of Faraday and Davy and the history through the years of people talking about, chemistry and electromagnetism and now nanotechnology and cancer research, and here we are today to push back the forefront of profanity. Okay, so it feels a little bit like bathos to be talking about swearing here, but one of the things that really astounded me when I was doing research for this book is not just how much research has been done into swearing and what it is and how it affects us from a psychological and a physiological point of view, or how it differs from culture to culture and place to place, but also how much swearing has actually contributed to our understanding of how our brains work, how they fit together, how we understand each other. And so hopefully tonight I can give you some of the highlights of the things that I found out while I was researching this book. And the working title wasn't going to be "Swearing is Good for You." I wasn't sure when I started out that it was. But I did know that it was fascinating. So the working title was "That's fucking amazing." They decided that we couldn't get away with a swear word on the front cover of the book, hence the slightly polemical "Swearing is Good for You." But I want to kind of preface that with the notion that there are lots of things that are good for you, but the poison is in the dose. So this is not about saying, that every other word should be the F word. And people ask me a lot whether or not I swear more now that I've written the book. And actually, I swear less, because I realize that profanity has a really important power, both individually and in society. But what I really want people to do is actually listen a bit more when they hear swearing and not fall prey to the understandable emotional reaction that you feel. We know we can measure the impact on the body and on the brain, and we can observe what happens to your cognition, to your emotions, and to your ability to process thoughts and memories when you hear swearing. And it's no surprise that when you hear it, the swearing tends to drown out everything else. But hopefully, by the end of tonight, I might have persuaded you that there are so many different signals we're sending when we swear. And it's important to listen to what's actually being said, as well as just go, "Oh, that was a four-letter word, my goodness." Although it is always good for getting a laugh out of an audience. But the trickiest thing for me when I started out researching for this book, and it was sort of kind of accidental, as Katie said, it was, my background is in artificial intelligence, and I was working out of the Science Museum, which is not as good as the Royal Institution, absolutely not. And we had to do some we chose to do some experiments on people who come to the Lates, which is not as good as the talks here of an evening, absolutely not. But it does have an open bar. And so every experiment we ever did, there was a nice correlation between whatever the variable was we were studying and the time of night. And that's because that was a proxy variable for just how drunk people were. So we never did any sort of real science in order to test a hypothesis at these Lates. But we did setting up experiments so that people could understand what it is that you have to think about when you're planning an experiment. So with that in mind, you may have noticed that I have this jar of ice, lovingly provided. It even says on it, "Ice Scoop." I like how everything's labeled here. I like the fact that there is a fire extinguisher at the back that says that it's suitable for use on lithium fires. That's when you know you're somewhere really fucking cool. Anyway, what I want is a really brave volunteer who is prepared to stick their hand in some ice water, not once but twice, not for the purposes of science, because we're not going to learn much from N of 1 in these uncontrolled conditions, but for the purposes of rhetoric, and also for the purposes of just sort of giving me someone to share the stage with. So is anyone willing? Oh, and there's a bribe. Whoever is willing to take part in this experiment will be recompensed with 2 superb badges based off the UK and the US cover. Anyone willing to put their hand in ice water for science? Yes, madam over here. Yay! Come on down. So can I get your name, first of all?
Jancy.
Jancy? Jancy, lovely name. Please do come around the desk. It's kind of like, imagine, you're Davy and I'm Faraday, right? Yeah. And you're telling me all about the chemical elements and I'm being inspired. And yeah, this is, right. Yep. So you are giving your first presentation at the Royal Institution?
Oh, yes.
Me too. Does it show? So, as you probably guessed, there's going to be some plunging of the hand in here. But in order to properly control this experiment, we have to be sure there isn't a recall effect on the words that you're using. So we're going to do it once with a swear word and once with a neutral word. Okay. So first of all, I'd like you to give me 5 words that spring to mind when I say, please describe this desk.
Brown, wood, old, clean. I can't think of a 5th one.
That's all right. Brown, wood, old, clean, and I can't think of a 5th one. And then if I dropped something on your foot right now, how would you likely react? What words or what sounds mean?
Oh, shit.
Oh, shit. Okay, that's brilliant. So that means that, oh, shit. Let's just use, actually, it's oh, shit. So it's brown, wood. So position 2 is going to be shit and wood. Those are your 2 words. Now, what to you is ruder, head or tails? Head, right. Who has got, me too. Who's got a coin they can toss? Yay, Katie. Okay. Oh, don't make me toss it. I'm terrible at this. Right, it is tails. So we're going to go with the polite word first. We're going to go with, it was brown or wood. Wood. So what I'm going to ask Jancy to do is steel herself, and when she's ready, plunge her hand into that bucket of ice water and try to keep it in there as long as possible. And as you're finding it more and more difficult, try using the word wood to inspire yourself. Out loud, you can use any intonation, any pace, any... but do keep just the one word, wood, one word. And does anyone have a stopwatch on their phone? I bet everyone's turned their phones off like very good people. Right. Stopwatch ready. Awesome. Jancy ready. And... Yay. So while Jancy is very bravely doing this and will eventually start to mutter wood in the background, and while the timing is going on, I'm going to depart the stage. One of the real difficulties is, how do we know that the word wood is not a swear word, but the word shit is?
It's not working.
It's not working. It's not working. You can take your hand out at any time, I promise you. There are no prizes for giving yourself frostbite. Okay, how long was that? 27 seconds. Yay, Jancy! Right. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is... Oh, I should have asked for a towel as well. Let me try. Okay. No. Because we're varying too many of the conditions at any one time. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take a little seat and allow yourself to come back up to normal body temperature. Okay. And I'll ask you to come back in a little bit. So, yay, Jancy! 27 seconds and shit. Those are the 2 things we have to remember. And also which hand that just was. So how do we know that wood is a swear word but shit is not? And the thing is that, unfortunately, for someone like me who's trying to research this, there is no extensional definition of what constitutes swearing. Sure, you can look in a dictionary and see which words have asterisks next to them, or even potentially which words are left out, although it's a very tricky way of finding out what something is. But there is no canonical definition and no canonical measure for swearing and its potency. You end up with kind of a circular definition if you look at the science. We know that swearing is swearing because it has this effect on your physiology, but we know about the effect of on the physiology because we have defined those terms as swearing. So I had to go out into linguistics, for example, and look at how swearing is defined across cultures. And it turns out that the things that are in common are the fact that it's to do with a taboo. It's always to do with something that you would be careful to mention in front of people who you don't know very well, or people with whom you have an authority to underling type relationship. And quite often you're less likely to use it if you are the person in authority, because it's something that tends to raise your power status, but temporarily. And I'll go into how that's kind of gendered as well in a bit, and then I'll go off on one and try and stick to the point. So there are these things in common. It's used as a essentially a verbal cudgel quite often, but it can also be used in ways that are happy. There's a paper that my husband and I wrote together, which is called Sweet FA, which was about football fans on Twitter, and the fact that if you look at the amount of swearing, you have no idea what's going on. But if you look at the ratio between the words fuck and shit, you know whether or not things are going well or they're going badly, because fuck is multi-purpose. Fuck yeah, oh, fuck no. Whereas shit is only ever bad. So make of that what you will about the satisfaction that we gain from those two experiences. So it's really hard to say, what is swearing as a class of terms. There's a standardized test for sense of humor, although having read some of the jokes that are on it, I worry about the people who wrote it. But there is a standardized test for measuring sense of humor, which is administered to stroke patients or people with dementia or people with other kinds of psychological illnesses. But there is nothing that allows us to define swearing. So various studies have spoken about swearing, sometimes without swearing. We have fantastic studies, case studies from medicine. For example, a stroke patient who, I think his pseudonym is usually given as Daniel, who lost the ability to come up with almost any form of propositional speech. And so the researchers would show him pictures of things or objects. They'd say, can you give me the name of this? And he would try. He'd try so hard. And you would see him attempting to produce these words, making sounds. And sometimes he would manage to utter a sound, but it would have nothing to do with the word for what he'd been shown. Until one day they were going through photographs of famous people. Who is this person? Who is this person? What is this object? Who is this person? Until they get to Ronald Reagan in the card deck. And they say he let loose with the most fluent profanity that they'd heard him produce. He used this set of words intentionally and with purpose, and they reflected his feelings about the former president of the United States, but they don't tell us what those words were. So it is so irritating when you're trying to uncover this, because actually linguists are far less mealy-mouthed than scientists when they're writing about swearing. So linguists will quite happily, there is the Lancaster corpus of abuse, which is not just people being rude in Lancaster, it's done at Lancaster University, but it is a subset of the British National Corpus that's got all the swears in it, which is terrific. That was somebody's job. And so we use things like that to have an idea of the frequency. We know the frequency with which words are used by the population at large. We have some idea of how much they're used by people with certain illnesses like Tourette's syndrome. But we don't know from individual medical studies or from lab studies until relatively recently what swear words people actually use, which makes life really tricky. But one of the things we do know is that if you allow people to pick swear words that they find particularly potent, you find clusters, and those clusters are based around age, class, gender, the country and the culture that you grew up in. So Robert Graves, who wrote I, Claudius, but also wrote something called Lars Porsena, The Future of Swearing, terrific little essay. And he writes about it, you can read it in a bus journey. It sounds very patronising, very short. But he talks at great length about the class difference between bastard and bugger in, sort of about the 1910s. And he talks about the fact that bastard is not an insult among his class, the higher social classes, because many a good family had started on the wrong side of the bed sheets. Anyone with the surname Fitz something, Fitzroy is bastard son of the king. It's not a bad thing to be. But he can't bring himself to write the word buggery. He talks about that vice of which Oscar was so famously convicted. He talks about Bulgarian heresy, but he cannot bring himself to say it, whereas he says that among the working classes, being a bastard is much more offensive. And he's talking about his time working with troops from different social classes. You cannot call them bastards because they'll take terrible offense, because the purity of their parents, particularly the purity of their mothers, is something that can be called into question to their detriment. But it's okay to call them buggers because, as he said, the working classes are charmingly free of the homosexual habit. So great linguist, but terrible social scientist. Anyway, when you ask people what their favorite swear words are, it's always defined by where they grew up and what social class they belong to. But the effects that they have, they can be completely different classes of words. It can be tabernacle in French-speaking Canada. It can be fuck in the UK. It could be cancer in Dutch or pig in German. But they all have that same effect on us. And one of the ways of measuring it's the efficacy of swearing, and one of the ways in which it's most clearly good for us, is the ability to help us withstand pain. So I don't want to prejudge how Jancy is going to respond, but how is your hand feeling now? Is it back up to room temperature? All right, could you come on back for us, please, Jancy? Yay! So we're going to need the stopwatch standing by again, if that's okay. This time, same hand, and this time you get to use shit. And again, same thing, that as you find yourself going, can't take this anymore, use the word, use it as strongly, as loudly. Nobody minds if Jancy says shit, do they? No. Do in any way that you like, and then let us know when you're ready to take your hand back out again. So while Jancy is succumbing to this again, which is awesome because she knows what she's in for this time, but she's still doing it. And of course, you have to randomize the order in which these things happen, because if you always give people one first and not the other, it's not a very good experiment. So you find that as people do this, that they tend to use the word, not just in one particular way, but the intonation becomes very important. And you can see this sort of wide emotional response, and that the variation in tone that people tend to use is much greater as well. It's much harder to say brown or wood in as many different ways as it is a swear word. And why is that? And it's, yes, okay, what was that? 46, woohoo! Thank you so much. Well done, Jancy. And Jancy is far from an aberration there, although that's nearly twice as long again. That's astounding. That when people have the free choice of what swear word they use, that they find their ability to withstand pain goes up. Also, your ability to lift heavy weights or to have more stamina. So the latest research by the same group shows that if you ask people to use one of those little hand pressure monitors, so it looks like a little hand exerciser, but is wired up so you know how much pressure is being held for how long, that when you're swearing, you are stronger for longer. And that is a really good diagnostic tool for whether or not something really is swearing. Because if you try a word that sounds similar, like fudge or sugar, or if you try a word that is swearing, but it's in a second language, someone says, the word joder is really rude in Spanish, say joder. That would do nothing for me because I don't have the emotional resonance that language, that term would have to someone who grew up in Spain. So while we can't, without being circular, use the pain test to define what constitutes swearing, it is a really good way of knowing whether or not swearing is authentic for you. And someone asked me the other day whether or not they were in Utah, and they said that the Mormon population around here will do anything to avoid direct swearing. They'll use all kinds of minced oaths. Is that real swearing or not? And the only way to be certain is to ask that person, what effect does it have on them? And even better, rather than asking them to interrogate their internal state, is to wire them up to a heart rate monitor or galvanic skin response monitor, because you can see how their heart rates change or how their adrenaline starts to flow when they say or when they use swearing. But we also react to swearing differently depending on who's using it. There's a study that's from 2002, so there's a good chance that in a decade and a half things might have changed. I really hope they have, but Robert P. O'Neill from the University of Louisiana did his doctoral thesis on how gender affects how we perceive swearing. And he took some vignettes of swearing. They were entirely fabricated, but he randomized, when he sent them to people, whether or not he was saying that they'd been said by a female speaker or a male speaker. So essentially just divided the pile into two, and half of them he said everything in column A is women, everything in column B is men. For the others, he reversed it. 377 people responded. A lot of people didn't say whether they were male or female, but there were definitely representatives of across the gender spectrum. And regardless of the gender of the reader, so women as well as men, said that women were less attractive, less trustworthy, less in control, less reliable if they swore. Men didn't have any of these effects. They were not considered less attractive. They were not considered less reliable. They were actually considered more powerful and more direct if they swore. And these are exactly the same words being used. It's only the supposed gender of the speaker that's changed. And yet in reality, again, corpus studies show that women do swear as much as men. We tend to use slightly milder forms, and we tend to be more careful about who we swear in front of and how we do it because of these persistent gender ideas that in swearing, it's defined by one of the people that I interviewed for the book as a gender transgressive act when you code people's behavior and then go out and do ethnography and watch how people respond to each other. Things like crossing your legs is considered more feminine than masculine. And it depends on where you are in the country, and even in Europe, parts of continental Europe, leg crossing is as much of a male signal as it is a female signal. In the United States, it's considered incredibly effeminate outside of large cities. And she talked about all of these different signifiers that you just don't notice, that you notice manspreading, just looking around the room and seeing who's sat like that and who's sat like this. The angle, someone actually, for science, goes out looking at men and women and basically going, yeah, I estimate that at like sort of 30 degrees, whereas that's more like sort of 50 degrees. And the reason that people look at this is because gender is this really evident signifier that we have. Gender, we make up our gender, we present our gender in various different ways. And although women swear as much as men, the forms of words that they use also tend to be milder. And if you look at corpus studies and you do a frequentist analysis and say, are there words that if I look at this and say, this person uses this word frequently, I could guess at far better than random chance whether or not they're male or female. The third most common signifier, so the third most obvious sign that the person that you're listening to or whose thing you're reading is a man or a woman, is the word fuck. Fuck is almost always uttered by a man in the British National Corpus. But again, this is quite old research. And one of the things that people sort of come back to me with is, but doesn't that mean women are better than men? Doesn't that mean that, this whole sort of Gaia hypothesis that the world would be better if it was run by women? I can barely get myself out of the house in the morning. I'm certainly not ready to take on repairing the planet. But there is this belief that purity of language and the ability to express yourself without swearing is somehow laudable. That not knowing swearing, that a form of deliberate ignorance on the part of women is somehow something to be proud of. And this all really goes back to one particular pamphlet, essentially called The Lady's Calling by Richard Alistry, that was written in the late 1600s, in which he said that women who swear would actually start to metamorphose. They would turn into men. I know. I mean, just look at how flat-chested I am. And he also said that there was no sound in the universe more offensive to the ears of God than an oath in the mouth of a woman. You've got kids in the street going, "Mister, I'm hungry." You've got people, dying of the plague. But no, it's a woman saying "fuck," and God is like, "Oh, I can't cope." Sorry, Richard Alistry and I would not have got on. It's fair to say. Mind you, there were other contemporaneous writers who also ripped into him. And there was a brilliant riposte to him that was written by, I cannot remember the name of the author, but the other best-selling pamphlet by this other author was called The Fart. So I feel he and I would have got on better. But that attitude, that pamphlet changed our attitudes to women swearing. I was lucky enough to meet an historian, John Gallagher, who's now up at the University of Leeds, previously at Trinity in Dublin, looking at how women used to swear particularly in medieval Britain, and the records of admiration of women and men who were fluent swearers, of this public display of swearing called flyting, and your ability to creatively curse and creatively insult and abuse people was a great marker of how inventive you were and how powerful you were. There were people who were paid to essentially be recreational swearers that would entertain at court banquets, and women were considered to be equally good as men. But somehow for 300, 400 years, there's been this lingering stench of Alistair's belief that women swearing is just, just completely aberrant, and that persists to this day. And one of the problems with that is that swearing is so powerful. Swearing has such an emotional resonance. It is such a marker of power in discourse. It's such a demand for somebody to pay attention to what you're saying. It is such a powerful way of getting someone to understand your emotional content at any given time that if you deliberately don't use it, you're essentially hamstringing yourself. It's like lacing yourself into a verbal corset. And we don't see the same effect to the same extent in all other languages. So there are plenty of cultures that have taken on this idea that women ought not to use these kinds of words, a new language for a lady, but it's not necessarily universal. And not all languages have gender-related slurs either. And interestingly, you can't correlate between whether or not language has gender-related slurs and how well women do in things like representation in politics or owning property. That actually there are some countries that are incredibly polite about women while not letting them drive. There are other countries that are very rude about women but let them be in parliament. So there isn't that direct correlation between how you feel about a bunch of people and how you speak about them when it comes to swearing. That we quite often mask our most unpalatable behavior towards one another in this kind of veneer of civil discourse. And it might be something we get on in the Q&As about, what should we do about civility? How can swearing be good for you when it can be so harmful? But we know that different languages all have some form of swearing. They have some form of bad language that is taboo, that is used to either amuse or abuse people, that is used to be forceful, and that has these impacts on people's emotions. And we also know that your window for learning those closes sometime around late adolescence. And a lot of this is to do with one particular Turkish researcher, whose surname I'm not even going to try to pronounce because it has an awful lot of cedillas in it. It's like Ayashigi. But she has worked with an awful lot of students who are bilingual Turkish-English speakers in both Turkish and United States universities. Those who became bilingual very early on, when you put them in sort of EEG machines, or you wire them up to galvanic skin monitors, or you measure their heart rate, or even measure things like their ability to remember what was said in a list of words, or there's an emotional Stroop test, which I'm not even going to try to explain now, but if you know the Stroop test where you see the name of a color written in a word other than that color, so the word green in red pen, and you have to say the color of the ink, not the color that is written, and it's really bloody difficult. There's an even more complicated one about emotions where you put, this is a positive word, but it's a noun, and if it's a noun, you have to say negative, and this is a negative adjective, but if it's an adjective, you have to say positive. And basically, anyone who is smart enough to understand the instructions, speaks the language well enough to follow what they're being told to do, will then have this emotional Stroop effect when it comes to swear words, but only in languages they learn before adolescence. My favorite description of this in this set of studies by this research group is of taking people who speak bilingual Turkish and English, who are in their mid-20s. They're mainly sort of graduate students and young associate professors and a few undergrads as well. And they wire them up with the galvanic skin monitors and the heart rates, and they have someone reading a standard set of prompts, and they are neutral terms that are not swearing, that are not negative, that are not considered to be in any sense emotive, the equivalent of brown and wooden and clean and flat. And then they have things that are potentially emotive but aren't necessarily swearing, like cancer or death or pain or war or disease or what have you. And then they have things that are swear words. And then they have things that are childhood reprimands. Go to your room, clean that up, don't ever let me see you doing that again. And they found that people who were fluent bilinguals before adolescence reacted very strongly to the swear words in both languages. People who were fluent bilinguals after adolescence didn't react very strongly to those swear words. But the strongest emotional reaction among particularly male students who were bilingual around 20-25 is their native language, sound of their mother telling them to pick their damn stuff up. So if you really want to get someone emotional, it's usually terms that you've learned really early on. And one of the reasons why we have swearing in so many languages is the fact that we learn swearing as kids. We're not taught it, we absorb it. And the way we absorb it is from the facial expressions of your parents and the people around you. So when you're very young, that set of mirror neurons that basically is saying that this is how people are reacting, this is what is permissible, this is how I'm meant to act in this set of circumstances, they are really active. You are learning things so quickly, like a big sponge. My daughter is at that stage now, she's nearly 2. My niece is nearly 4. And she has discovered, having been toilet trained, that anything to do with the potty is hilarious. That sitting at the dinner table going, poo, 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 daddy, poo, poo, daddy, poo, daddy, poo, is a really good way of getting attention. Sorry, Romilly, if you're ever watching this on YouTube in the future, but it is adorable. I'm going to embarrass you so much on your 18th. I will be disowned by then, it's fine. And that she knows from our reaction, because even if you're trying to do the whole sort of enlightened parent thing of going, yeah, okay, we're just going to ignore it and say, sorry, just concentrate on dinner, she can tell that something emotional has happened. And she knows that things to do with the potty are taboo. She's starting to get her privacy norms. My 2-year-old will follow her into the toilet and she will now say no. Whereas about 6 months ago, she was consistently following me into the toilet. And we didn't teach her to say poo or wee face, or I certainly didn't anyway. And we don't think she's picked it up in nursery. Actually, there's fantastic research by 2 developmental psychologists in the States, Tim and Kristen Jay, who say that actually they don't pick it up in general from older siblings. Even kids that are homeschooled or in some way isolated from other children spontaneously start to swear. And in every culture, there is something that makes us feel awkward. In every culture, there is something that we are concerned about. And in different cultures, it's different things. So in Japan, excrement is not anywhere near as emotive as it is here in the West, which is why you have a poop emoji, for example. But that every culture, there will be something that your parents or your teachers or the people around you have either gone, don't do that, or smack you around the head, or just laughed. And at that point, you realize that, you're a toddler. You're this big. The power you have in the world so far has been lying on the floor and screaming, or biting, or kicking, or punching. All of a sudden, you realize you can get a massive reaction with this tiny sound. It's 3 letters long. I'm not sure she can spell poo yet, but it is three letters long. And she says poo, and she can stop the discourse at the table, which is much more powerful than anything else she's been able to do before. And that's such a human thing. But it's not just a human thing. So there's a fantastic project. Many people have heard of Project NIM, which was an attempt to teach a chimpanzee how to communicate using gestural language, using sign language, in a laboratory, which is not how we learn language. And there were many fascinating things about Project NIM, but it was not a good replication of the way in which language is transmitted among humans. So a different example, a more well-rounded example, is Project Washoe. Hasn't had a film made out of it, but it is an amazing study, and if you can get hold of a book by Roger Foots called Next of Kin, it is fantastic reading. So for a long time, like going back to the 1890s, people have been talking about the idea of trying to teach chimpanzees language. There were a couple of society people, the Kellogg's, somebody in Llewellyn Kellogg in the 1800s, who were the first to cross-foster a chimpanzee in the hopes that this chimpanzee would learn language. And the chimpanzee was, I think, about 6 months older than their son. And the chimpanzee didn't learn how to speak English. Later turns out that chimpanzees just don't have the vocal cords for it. But their son started to hoot like a chimpanzee, at which point the chimpanzee was quietly shipped off. But people who looked at chimpanzee physiology said, there's no way they're going to be able to articulate the way that we do. Their tongues are far too muscular. They're not as deft as ours. Their vocal cords don't vibrate the way that ours do. But they are very good with their hands. Can we teach them something like American Sign Language? And Roger Foots spent almost his entire life living with chimpanzees. In fact, Roger Foots and his wife Debbie and their kids. And what they did was they fostered chimpanzees into their home, and they taught them sign language by only ever using sign language, not just with the chimpanzees, but with each other whenever the chimpanzees were around. They didn't want the chimpanzees to think that this was kind of nursery talk, a different way of communicating. They wanted it to be as much like a human child learning language as possible. That is, by absorbing it, by example, by needing to communicate in order to achieve things. And boy, did these chimpanzees learn language. They learned it, and they started to invent it too. So, for example, Washoe spontaneously put together the words hot and drink for thermos flask the first time that she discovered what it did. They understood the emotional responses of people as well. So one of their research students, or research fellows, had gone away to have a child that had sadly been stillborn. And Washoe lost her offspring, her son, after a horrible accident. I strongly recommend reading Next of Kin. It is a powerful read and touches on ethics of primate research. And she had gone through this grieving process. And when this research assistant came back and said, Washoe was like, where were you? Where did you go? And she said, I had a baby and my baby died. And Washoe said, my baby died too. It is very sad. And that's not the action of an animal that has learnt how to beg for treats with gestures. That is the action, the communication of a creature with a theory of mind, an understanding of a shared emotional state. Which means that the fact that she used to use her word for shit in order to wind up her keeper means that she probably was swearing. Spontaneously, again, like toddlers, Roger Foots did not teach Washoe and Luli and Tatu and Dar, the other chimpanzees who all lived together. He didn't teach them how to swear. He didn't think there was any particular benefit in teaching them how to swear. But he did potty train them. He and his assistants worked very hard to potty train them, to the point that they completely internalized the same potty taboos that my niece is now having. They wanted privacy when they had bowel movements, when they needed to urinate. They would go somewhere else. And even out in the wild, when walking through the forests, they would take themselves away, or then they would ask for receptacles. So there's a story about how Washoe would beg for an empty coffee can to do her business in, because shitting in the woods was just not something she could bring herself to do anymore. But there is a sign, I have to be very careful because I'm using a head mic, but there is a sign that they were taught which is dirty. And dirty is everything to do with going to the potty. And in fact, they invented the sign, which dirty good, which is the sign for a potty. It's the right place for dirty. But if Roger wouldn't let Tato or Dar or Luli or Washoe out to play, or was saying, no treats right now, we're going to do this particular experiment, again, all in sign language, she would get quite frustrated sometimes, and she would start to say to him, like, dirty Roger, dirty. And if another chimpanzee would, take someone else's thing or sleep in their favorite swinging tire or what have you, they would argue with each other, and they would say things like, dirty monkey. And the more angry they got, in the same way that Jancy earlier, when she was saying shit, the more she needed that word to have power, the more she would iterate it. You can almost physically shove more feelings into swear words. It's the same with the sign dirty. And he writes about how when there were serious arguments going on in the lab, you could hear their teeth clacking together as they would do this sign, very much like the Italian forearm punch, which I can't remember what it's called. It has a name. I sat in the library, the British Library, doing the research for this, and I got the Ofcom list of what's not broadcastable. And there was the list of various gestures. And one of them was, I think it's the Nepalese forearm or something. So I'm going through and I'm going, oh, yeah, no, but yeah, no, I get that one. Nepalese forearm, yeah, wanker, I get that. Which one's the blowjob sign? Oh, God, I'm sitting in the British Library doing the blowjobs. I'm the woman sitting in the... So, yes, I don't go back to the second floor Humanities Library anymore. I'm no longer welcome. That was a digression, sorry. So, yeah, I know that, like I said earlier, swearing is very difficult to pin down. But that the working definition, if you are prepared to accept as a working definition, that it is something that is taboo. And if you know that a taboo is something that you feel enough shame about to lie about, or to try to hide, or to do in privacy, and if there is a sign for that taboo that is used in anger or frustration or to intensify things, I think I am prepared to say that that is swearing. I personally accept that as swearing. Whether it's my niece saying poo face, or a chimpanzee saying, dirty, or a Canadian person saying tabernacle, just because it isn't swearing to me doesn't mean it's not swearing. And for that reason, I'm passionately in favor of the recent move by the American Humane Society and the, I can't remember which administration it is, but that chimpanzees can now no longer be used for clinical research in the United States, and that there have to be strong ethical safeguards in place for behavioral research on chimpanzees as well. I've worked in AI now for 15, 20 years, and have spent a long time in conferences, triple AI, there's always, one gala dinner, and we all go out, we'll go, how will we treat AIs? What will be the ethics of treating this non-human intelligence among us? And it was only in writing this book I realized that there is a non-human intelligence among us, and it has a theory of mind that is sufficiently good to both invent swearing and know exactly when to use it. So people do say to me, you work in AI, and I kind of buy that you got into the swearing thing because it's interesting and fun, and you are a sadistic bitch who likes making people put their hands in ice water. I'm sorry, Tansy. But how does this relate, writing off a funding proposal, how does this relate to your core research? And the answer is that so far it doesn't. But if I had to shoehorn it, no, so far it doesn't. But as we're getting used to the idea of living with, not robots, but automation that is trying to use language to communicate, and as I've argued, swearing is one of the most powerful linguistic tools there are, we're going to have to be really careful how we design how it handles strong language. So I, at the moment, design conversational interfaces for a living. I basically make it so that anyone who's used sort of Siri or Google Home or Alexa, the Google Assistant is by far the best at the moment, but that kind of ability to have an ongoing contextual discourse, or at least conversation, with an automaton, with something that's basically just trying to figure out what you meant and answer appropriately. One of my jobs is to put together what we know about human cognition, human information processing, something called the automation bias, which is this really, really stupid human desire to trust computers. I know the people who program these things. For God's sake, if your GPS says drive off a cliff, do not drive off a cliff. It's not as smart as you are, but we have this. I used to work in decision support for medical systems, and there is this danger that a trained physician will accept from an apparent AI from a decision support system a piece of advice, erroneous advice, that they would definitely challenge if it was one of their professional colleagues. So my job is to take all of these things that we know and try to make really good conversational interfaces, things that people go, aha, I know how to talk to this thing in order to make it do what I need it to do. That isn't like the old command line stuff of, you need to know the exact magic invocation to get it to do something. You can just talk the way you'd talk. And so I build these things, and I have these clients, and they come to us and they say, can you, we need something for, say, banking, we need something to allow people to transfer money, or in medical things, we need someone to remind people to take their medication or to tell them whether or not there's a drug interaction. You go, brilliant, I'm gonna work out what all the cognitive flows of this are, I'm gonna work out all of the data that we need to know, we're gonna build the systems in the back end, we're gonna have them all work together seamlessly, and you hand it over to them, and they go, oh, that's great. What happens if I go, hey, fuck you? So the first thing that I always program in now is a response to that. I'm not kidding. She's not CEO, she's the program director. Michelle, if you hear this, I'm sorry for name-checking you, but my God, this was the best test ever. I built something for my colleagues to play with, and I had forgotten that the person who is in charge of this entire project, and is a woman with immense power in the organization, I'd forgotten she's Irish. So the set of profanity that I had trained it to understand did not include feck. And my demo failed, and to this day I'm trying to live down my shame of not knowing it would be tested with feck. But whenever I'm designing these things, I go by the same sort of data principle that machines should work with, which is to be accepting of anything, but careful with what you give back. I would never design a conversational interface that swears at the user. But somebody posted a dialogue with, I think it was Siri the other day, when they'd said, hey, Siri, how is it going to be this fucking cold? And Siri responded with, there's no need for that. It's like, no, person who designed that interaction, there's no need for that. Siri can't be offended. Siri cannot have the emotional response that we have as a species. There is no biology in there to experience a taboo, to experience that raised adrenaline level. And all you've done is say to that person, I refuse to engage with you because you said a swear. That's just ridiculous. What that person wanted to know is, please, will it get warm soon? I'm sad about this weather. I don't like it anymore. And that's the message that when I say, I want people to listen more and not switch off when they hear swearing, is that we don't always use swearing in order to be utter bastards. Sometimes we use it because we're trying to make a point. We want something to be memorable. We want something to pack a punch. We want something that really expresses either the depths or the heights of the feelings that we have. And when you turn around and say, nope, you swore, I'm not going to listen to you anymore, as I've been trained to do working in telephone customer service, you deny the strength of that experience, and you deny the strength of that rhetorical tool or that emotional tool. So I'm not suggesting that we all sort of basically go, I'm happy to take whatever abuse the internet throws at me. Oh my God, I'm not happy to take whatever abuse the internet throws at me. But I know that someone can call me the C word, and if it's a mate of mine, that, maybe that's a form of respect. Maybe it's a form of grudging admiration, depending on what I've just done. But if a complete stranger says, well, that woman's got idea, the word woman can be wielded in such a way as to be, as derogatory. And I'm lucky, going to get all intersectional there, I'm really bloody lucky, because that's the only word, the only slurs that I've had to deal with are based on my gender. Because as far as anyone else can tell, I'm fully able-bodied. No one can tell anything in particular about my sexuality, and my skin couldn't be fucking paler. So there are a whole host of terms that have never been wielded towards me as weapons. And again, we might get onto more about this in the questions and answers because I don't have slides on this, but I don't think that swearing is the problem. People talk about the incivility of social media, the YouTube comments and Twitter, and how people can be inexorably vile. And one of the things that comes up is the use of the F word or the use of the C word. And I don't think that it's the C word that's the problem. When Donald Trump referred to Hillary Clinton as a nasty woman, he meant exactly the same thing as YouTube commenters mean when they put cunt under my videos. I know they mean exactly the same thing. You're a woman with an opinion that I don't agree with. Fuck you. And that's fine. I mean, it's not fine that they think that. But the use of the C word is not what makes it a really wearing thing to have to deal with. What makes it a really wearing thing to have to deal with is someone deciding that my gender is another thing in the minus column for me. And I think that this desire for civility, there are a couple of people I interviewed for the book who train people out of swearing, and this belief that we can cure our industries and our organizations and ourselves of swearing, we can purge this language and somehow purge our bad thoughts and feelings, is completely false. I mean, when you look at the way that swearing is used, and you look at the ways that it can be celebratory, that it can be pain-killing, the way that it can be unifying, particularly the ones that are to do with bodily functions. I mean, everybody poops. Those are the kinds of words that I think we need to keep. It's the attitudes underneath some of those things that can be couched as civilly as you like that need to change. And when you come across those attitudes, I think you are perfectly entitled to say to somebody, fuck you, because in that sense at least, swearing is definitely good for you. Thank you.